There's a chapter in the Daggerheart rulebook that teaches game masters how to run adventures, and before the core GM mechanics section, where you learn about things like fall damage or underwater combat, there's a section called Core Guidance. This part isn't about running the game correctly, it's about running the game in a way that doesn't have your friends suddenly realizing that on second thought, they aren't actually free on Tuesday nights. It's about how to be a great game master. The book goes over 7 GM principles, 11 best practices, and 6 pitfalls to avoid, totaling 24 separate pieces of advice to follow. But don't worry, after going through all of them, those 24 tips can be sorted into just 5 main points. 4 of those 5 are genuinely useful, not just for Daggerheart, but for any heroic fantasy game. The 5th one, well, I'm not so sure about it, but we'll talk about why later in the video. Hey fiends, I'm Ginny D, and it's officially spooky season, which means this devilish design is back for a limited time. Order yours at ginnyd.com/shop. Or don't, I'm not a cop. Daggerheart is the new-ish fantasy RPG from Darrington Press, which is Critical Role's publishing arm. It's designed to be a heroic narrative game for telling character-focused stories. You know, like Critical Role. But even if you don't play Daggerheart, if that description lines up with how you play games like D&D or Pathfinder or other RPGs, then these 5 principles will probably be useful for you too. Darrington Press did not sponsor this video, by the way, and why would they, when I keep talking about their game for free? I'm good at business. Anyway, they did send me a copy of the book. To explain this first point, let's take a second to look at one of the most popular house rules in D&D, what's often called the Rule of Cool. If you haven't heard of this, it's basically just that your GM might let you bend or even break the rules if they're getting in the way of a cool narrative opportunity. This is a perfect example of the first tip that the Daggerheart rulebook is pushing here. The mechanics are there to support the story, not the other way around. Have you ever played with somebody who's always scanning their character sheet or the rulebook, looking for something on there that'll tell them what to do? This is saying don't do that. Don't even worry about what's in the rules until you've already thought about where the story is leading you. Daggerheart phrases this as begin and end with the fiction. Think first about the narrative, and only then should you look to the game mechanics, if necessary, to make those narrative moves happen. If your party is sneaking up on an unsuspecting guard and they've been quiet and had a good plan, and honestly you didn't even give that guard a name, you can just let them slit his throat. Sure, the rules may not technically support an instant kill like that, but you don't have to bring the rules in until they would serve the story. There's another GM principle on Daggerheart's list that's saying something similar. Make every roll important. Be careful with this one. It doesn't mean call for a roll and then scramble to make it matter. It means don't call for the roll at all unless it matters. See the difference there? One of my early struggles with GMing Daggerheart was feeling like there was a ton of pressure on me to be constantly coming up with these big story moves anytime players did anything. But a lot of what was happening there is that my brain was so D&D pilled that I was just calling for way too many rolls, which is kind of funny because D&D actually gives this same advice, only roll when there are consequences for failure. I even made a whole video about it. But I have this goblin brain that's just like, math rocks go click clack. The point is, story first, and then dice if necessary. There's a third version of this advice in the list of best practices, bring the game's mechanics to life. Sometimes the tabletop community talks about roleplay versus roleplay. Man, that really doesn't work out loud. Roleplay versus roleplay. The idea is that if you lean too hard on the dice, you're not actually roleplaying. You're not embodying your character and trying to immerse yourself in the story. Overall, I think this is strong advice. Not for everyone. There are definitely people who prefer a more mechanics-forward game. But for anyone who's trying to center the storytelling, remember, your mechanics are tools. You want those tools nearby, but not like clutched in both hands at all times. Because when you're holding a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And when you're holding dice, everything looks like a skill check. Now that I've spent the last few minutes talking you out of rolling dice, let's talk about today's sponsor, who would really prefer that you do. Like I said, I'm really good at business. Props can be a great way to immerse players in your game. Why drink out of a glass or a solo cup when you can quaff that LaCroix out of a whole-ass tankard? Describing players receiving a mysterious letter is fun, but handing them a real wax-sealed envelope is next level. And it's even better when those props not only contribute to the atmosphere, but also make the game easier. That's why Gyld made these healing potion dice. Each set of dice is everything you need to roll a healing potion, color-coded and separated based on the type. There's even one die in each set with the same number on every side for the bonus. No more, what do I add to a superior potion of healing again? Just roll all the dice and count all the numbers. They have dice for all 4 types of healing potions, each in their own little glass vial. And if that doesn't make you feel enough like a fancy little alchemist, the full set comes with an embossed faux leather case to hold your healing potion vials. You can get these and any of Gyld's other highly specific dice at the link in the description, which will also give you a discount on your order. At this point, you might be thinking, Ginny, this is unnecessary. Has immersion gone too far? And my answer is, not yet. But we can change that. Next time your player describes attacking an NPC, hand them a sword, and then just hold eye contact. Come on, killer. Let's dance. Please do not dare your players to run you through. Based on the stories that some of you guys share in my comments, some of them might call your bluff. Anyway, Daggerheart's second tip for Game Masters shows up in 4 different formats throughout these pages, but it really comes down to this: you are not in charge. If you became a Game Master because you just really wanted to be the boss for once, I'm sorry to report that you have taken a wrong turn. The more you wrestle for control, the worse your game will probably get, because the whole point of tabletop games is that the player's choices actually matter. Tragic, I know. One of Daggerheart's GM principles is play to find out what happens, which they did not invent, but borrowed from Apocalypse World, as far as I can tell. What it means is that the story isn't pre-written. You have to play to find out how it ends. I will never forget the game that I played in for months and months, only for an NPC with godlike powers to swoop in, nullify all of our abilities with no save, steal the MacGuffin, and disappear. And then the DM excitedly said, "I've known that was going to happen for a year." My immediate reaction was, oh, so you didn't need us then. One of the biggest pitfalls for any game master is prepping for a tabletop game like they're writing a movie script, and the players are just actors here to perform. But that's not the job. The game master isn't here to tell the players a story. Play to find out means that you all get to experience suspense and surprise and learn how the story ends together. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't plan. Trust me, I am not a fly by the seat of my pants GM. I need my notes and my contingency notes and my emergency notes for if the first 2 sets of notes catch fire. But as Daggerheart's GM principles say, hold on gently. They warn you to avoid pitfalls like over-planning and relying on players finding singular solutions that you've prepared. My DM Jesse has his own version of this, which is that he says he doesn't write what will happen, he writes what will happen if the players don't intervene. You're the guide, so remember the kind of story that you all agreed to tell and give direction when it's needed, but be ready to let go and follow something unexpected if that's where the fiction leads you. I almost called this next one You Are Not in Charge Part 2, but it really does deserve its own heading because these tips are specifically about collaboration. In a game like D&D, players usually only control their characters, while the DM runs everything else. Daggerheart cranks up the group project energy by encouraging you to ask players to describe parts of the world and then accept their answers as canon. This is what they're referencing in the GM principle, ask questions and incorporate the answers, which is how one of my NPCs ended up with a passion for crochet. But honestly, the tips that I'm lumping together here aren't all limited to games that do that. When the rulebook says collaborate even in conflict, what it really means is the GM and players aren't enemies. Yet another tip that I've previously made an entire video about. I know that might sound obvious, but a lot of tables still need to hear it. Yes, the DM controls the monsters, but every real person at the table is on the same team. You're all just trying to share a cool story before the game collapses because somebody has a baby or gets a new work schedule. The warning against undermining the heroes on the list of pitfalls is not exactly the same thing, but the Venn diagram has a big overlap. It basically just means don't make the player characters look stupid. They're supposed to be the heroes, so even when they fail, they shouldn't look incompetent. Unless you have players like mine who really enjoy that, in which case carry on. In their best practices list, we have tell them what they'd know. If the character can see a door or smell fire or feel the ground shaking, you need to say that out loud because you're the lens through which they experience the world. If you don't mention it, it basically doesn't exist, which is why I never talk about the growing pile of unfolded laundry. Oh crap. The rulebook specifically notes that these kinds of things shouldn't be gated behind a roll, another little reminder to not lean on the dice when it's not necessary. In most cases, your players should not be rolling for door. Daggerheart also lists reframe rather than reject as a best practice, which is honestly solid life advice in general. If a player says they want to convince the dragon to be their friend, your first instinct might be to say no, and then privately congratulate yourself for not laughing in their face. But even that flat no can make someone less likely to try creative stuff later. Reframing means keeping the spirit of their idea without letting it completely throw off the game. So instead of no, try, this dragon seems too hostile to jump right to friendship, but you might be able to stroke its ego and buy enough time to not get immolated immediately. That way you reward creative thinking and everyone gets to live to make bad choices another day. Probably the most Daggerheart specific tip under this heading is the warning against always telling the players what to roll. Daggerheart wants players to make a case for which skill or stat applies, which isn't going to fit into all games. When I'm running D&D, I'm fine with the occasional, Your Honor, I'd like to use intelligence for my intimidation check. Sure, if you can logic someone into being afraid of you, go for it, sustain. But not every DM wants to open that door, because once you do, every roll could turn into a how can I use my best stat again puzzle. Either way, the general message of these tips is that players aren't just actors in this shared story, they should also be in the writing room. Okay, onward to the fourth point, which basically boils down to be nice. And before you roll your eyes and say, yeah, obviously, I actually think the things on this list are worth saying out loud. Sure, some people just choose to be unpleasant, and they'll continue their little villain arc, but there are also a lot of unspoken rules around social interaction. And in something as social as tabletop games, it costs us nothing to actually say them and give people a chance to learn. Not everyone can intuit this stuff, especially if they're new to the hobby and don't know what counts as bad manners yet. The tips I'm grouping here all come from the GM best practices list, starting with gain your players' trust. I actually think this is something we don't talk about enough in tabletop. The entire game falls apart if you don't trust your GM, because players technically have no power. The GM can fudge rolls, hand out impossible DCs, and murder the party's allies off-screen without so much as a dice roll. The whole thing works because we trust that the GM is acting in good faith. It's a dictatorship, but hopefully a benevolent one. That's why I always carry a sword, so I can enforce my benevolence. Go on, say I'm one of the good dictators. Say it. Now, I know this is not a black and white issue. I have defended tweaking monsters mid-combat and offering players false choices, and some people have very strongly disagreed with me about that. I see those multi-paragraph comments, and honestly, it's good to have a passion. We all draw the line differently between showmanship lies and trust-breaking lies, but wherever you draw it, your players need to believe that you are running the game in good faith, because if they don't trust you, none of this matters. You'll just become a dictator who hangs out alone on Tuesday nights, while your citizens do something more fun. The next tip is help players use the game, and this one honestly does feel like the most obvious to me. Part of a game master's role is to help players learn the rules, even if you're still figuring them out yourself. You are the rules referee, whether you like it or not. I have seen people lose it over this, and I just want to say, if you only want experienced players at your table, just say that. You don't have to let beginners join your table if you know that you're going to roll your eyes when they ask questions. This has a lot of crossover with the best practice create a meta conversation, which is just a fancy way to say make sure your players feel comfortable talking to you above table, about the rules, about their boundaries, about where the story's going, about whether you'd rather fight a horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses. You know, important conversations. Okay, we have covered 16 of the 24 tips in this section. Well, let's call it 17 because one tip is don't hoard fear, which is Daggerheart specific and doesn't really apply elsewhere. That leaves us with 7 tips that I'm grouping together into my last category, get good. There's a GM principle called fill the world with life, wonder, and danger, which basically translates to be good at world building. There's the best practice that says cultivate a curious table, aka have engaged players, and another one that says ground the world in motive, aka create good NPCs. And there are 4 separate tips that all basically mean don't let the game get boring ever. This is my least favorite section because even though all of these are describing important game master skills, it also feels a little bit like draw the rest of the owl. You know, it's all well and good to say ground the world in motive, but knowing that characters should have individual motivations doesn't make it magically easy to come up with them on the spot for every single character that your oh so collaborative players shove into the spotlight. Of course, you want a world filled with exciting things, but you're still the one who has to come up with all those exciting things. There's a lot I like about Daggerheart, but one of the things that has been a challenge for me is that I feel like it puts a lot of pressure on game masters to be infinitely creative. When someone rolls with fear, you immediately need a consequence that pushes the story forward. When a scene starts to drag, you're expected to instantly pivot to something exciting. These are great reminders of what makes an excellent GM. They just don't actually teach you how to be one. A few of these tips kind of feel like the designers saying, want to run a fantastic game? Easy, just be fantastic. I know this is a lot to ask from a single 6-page section of a rulebook. It's not reasonable to expect this list to teach you creativity or improvisation. But putting fill the world with life, wonder, and danger right next to something simple like ask questions and incorporate the answers makes it sound like those two things are equally easy, and they are definitely not. There is nothing wrong with a game that expects a lot from its players and game masters. Challenge is good, and nobody's born a perfect GM, but Daggerheart likes to describe itself as free-flowing and streamlined, which can give you a little whiplash once you find out that it's a deceptively difficult game to run. Sure, it doesn't have a bunch of crunchy mechanics, but it is asking you to flex creative muscles that take time to build, especially when compared to games like D&D, where you can choose to be creative, but you also have structure to fall back on if you're light on ideas. A lot of the skills I've grouped in this section take game masters years to learn. So yeah, practice those skills. Learn to build dynamic worlds, motivated NPCs, and engaged players. It will definitely make your games better. But don't let the casual way this book talks about them convince you that you should already know how. Most of us are still figuring out how to draw the f***ing owl. In general, I think the advice in these pages is pretty good, if kind of repetitive. I don't think we need keep the story moving and cut to the action and don't let scenes drag. We get it, gotta go fast. But if you're looking for some more conceptual guidance on being a good game master, regardless of the system you're using, I do think Daggerheart's suggestions are a useful resource. This is my third video digging into some part of Daggerheart, and it's been a nice change of pace. The numbers suggest that you guys feel the same way, so let me know in the comments if there's anything specific about Daggerheart that you'd like to see me explore. And don't forget, this Hey Fiends shirt is limited edition, hell is empty, and all the devils are here in my shop, and won't be restocked once they're sold out. That's the saying, right?